Keanu Reeves was just about to sit down for dinner when the phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw his father's name flashing in bold letters. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the kind of call he'd expected. Not now, not like this. For the past few years, his father had been in and out of the hospital, battling health issues that seemed to come and go. Keanu had gotten used to the idea that his father might never be fully well again, but still the phone call shook him. He quickly answered. "Keanu." His father's voice was faint, weaker than usual. "I need you to come to the hospital. I don't have much time." Keanu's stomach dropped. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father had always been a stoic man, rarely showing signs of vulnerability. But now there was something in his voice that made Keanu feel like the world was suddenly tilting beneath him. "Dad? What's going on?" Keanu's voice was steady, but inside he felt a growing sense of panic. There was a pause on the other end. "Just come, son, please. I need to see you." The urgency was palpable. Keanu's mind raced, and before he could ask any more questions, he hung up. His hands shook as he grabbed his keys, throwing on his jacket and running out the door. He didn't even know what was happening, just that something was terribly wrong. As Keanu drove through the streets, his mind kept replaying the call. What was so urgent? Why hadn't he told me more? His father, a man who had always been proud and independent, never asked for help. So why now? What did he mean by, "I don't have much time"? With every turn, every streetlight that passed in a blur, the questions kept piling up. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He hadn't seen his father in weeks, too caught up in his own life to make the trip. He had promised himself he'd visit soon, but now it seemed that time had run out. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The thought gnawed at him. What if this was it? What if I never get to say the things I've been putting off? The hospital loomed ahead, its bright lights cutting through the night like a beacon. Keanu parked hastily, his heart thumping in his chest as he rushed inside. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air around him was thick with anticipation. He approached the elevator. A nurse emerged from the waiting area. She glanced at him, recognition flashing in her eyes, before her face softened with a quiet sympathy. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, "your father's waiting for you. Room 304. Keanu nodded, swallowing hard. He could feel his legs trembling beneath him, but he forced himself to walk forward. Each footstep seemed to echo louder in the empty hallways. "Come on, Keanu. Pull it together," he thought, trying to steady his breathing. He reached room 304 and stopped in front of the door. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the sterile white door. Behind it, his father lay waiting, vulnerable in a way he never had been before. He took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. Keanu stepped into the room, his heart beating in his throat. The soft hum of machines filled the sterile space, but it was the sight of his father lying there in a hospital bed that truly took his breath away. The man who had once been larger than life, who had shaped Keanu's world, now looked frail, his face pale, and his body too still. For a long moment, Keanu simply stood there, unable to speak. His father, Jack Reeves, was awake and conscious, but his tired eyes only flickered toward his son before they closed briefly in exhaustion. "Hey, old man," Keanu said quietly, forcing a smile despite the tightening in his chest. His voice sounded unfamiliar to him, small and vulnerable. "You've certainly scared me this time." Jack's lips curled into a weak smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You always were a bit of a worrywart," he replied, his voice raspy, but familiar. Keanu sat down beside his father, carefully adjusting the chair, suddenly aware of how much time had passed since they last shared a moment like this. The years had been long and complicated. Their relationship hadn't always been easy. In fact, for much of Keanu's life, there had been a distance between them that he never quite understood. Jack had always been a reserved man, a quiet figure, who preferred working with his hands to expressing emotions. He was the kind of father who showed his love through action, fixing things around the house, ensuring there was always food on the table, and making sure Keanu knew right from wrong. But there was no room for words in his world. No discussions. about feelings or the little things that made a family feel whole. Keanu had often wondered if his father even knew how to say, "I love you." Keanu's childhood had been a mix of admiration and longing. He admired his father's strength and determination, but there was always an ache, a need for connection that was left unspoken. Jack had never been the father who told stories or shared his feelings, and as Keanu grew older, he realized that their bond wasn't built on words. It was built on the quiet presence of a man who showed his love by being there, even when he didn't know how to express it. As Keanu sat next, to him now memories began to flood back. He thought of the times his father had taken him fishing, the silence between them only broken by the occasional sound of water splashing and the rustle of trees. There had been no deep conversations on those trips, no heart-to-heart talks. But Keanu could remember feeling the weight of his father's love in those simple moments, and somehow that had always been enough. Keanu's gaze wandered over the small framed photographs that sat on the bedside table. One photo caught his eye, a snapshot from when he was just a boy, smiling with his arms around his father's shoulders. He picked it up, studying the image. In it, his father looked younger, more vibrant. "I remember that day," Keanu said softly, his fingers brushing the photo. "You took me to the lake. I caught the biggest fish of my life." Jack's tired eyes opened again, a faint twinkle of recognition in them. "You were so proud of that fish. You wouldn't let me hear the end of it for weeks." Keanu chuckled, softly, the memory bringing a bittersweet smile to his face. He had been so young then, so eager to impress his father, to make him proud. And his father, despite his reserved nature, had shown pride in his own way. By taking the time to be there, by celebrating the little victories that mattered most to his son. Jack's eyes wandered to the photo album on the side table, an album Keanu hadn't noticed before. With a slight nod, Jack motioned to it. "Bring it here," he said with a raspy voice, his fingers weakly reaching toward the album. Keanu opened it carefully, flipping through the pages of old photographs. As his eyes scanned the images, his father in his prime, young Keanu full of life, moments of laughter and family holidays, he felt the weight of the years between them. There were so many moments they hadn't shared, so much time lost in the busyness of life. The realization stung. His father spoke again, breaking the silence. "I never knew how to be the kind of father you needed me to be, son. I thought if I worked hard enough and kept us going, that would be enough. But maybe it wasn't." Keanu's heart ached at the raw honesty in his father's voice. This was the conversation he had longed for, one that had never come until now. He put down the album and took his father's hand in his, squeezing it. "Gently." "You were enough, Dad," Keanu said softly. "You showed me love in ways I never understood until I got older. It wasn't always about the words." "I see that now." Jack squeezed his son's hand weakly in return, a tired but satisfied smile creeping onto his face. "I always tried." Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting the moment settle between them. He realized, for the first time, that maybe his father didn't need to say the things he had always wanted to hear. Jack had shown his love with every action, with every sacrifice, with every quiet moment they had shared. Keanu had always felt it, even if he hadn't always understood it. The room was quiet for a moment as father and son sat there, together in their silence. Keanu's heart felt heavy with all the lost time, but in the stillness there was a sense of peace, a sense of closure that he hadn't expected to find so soon. The room felt still, almost too still, as Keanu sat at his father's bedside, the weight of the past hanging heavily in the air. Every breath his father took seemed labored, each exhale longer than the last, and Keanu couldn't help but notice how fragile he looked now. This wasn't the father he had known as a child, the man who had lifted him up when he fell, who had been his rock through the chaos of the world. But now, that rock was crumbling. Keanu stood and moved closer to the window, the dim hospital light, casting a soft glow over the city outside. The world beyond felt so distant, so far removed from the pain and the fragile moment he was experiencing. How had they ended up here? How had time managed to slip away so quickly, leaving them with nothing but a handful of memories and a hospital room to hold on to? As he stared out the window, he realized just how much he had taken his father for granted. The years had been filled with his own projects, his own life, the busy whirlwind of his career and personal struggles. How many times had he promised to visit his father, to call more often? Yet somehow life always seemed to take precedence. Keanu knew he wasn't the only one to blame. His father, too, had kept his distance in his own way, buried in his pride and the stoic silence that had been a part of him for as long as Keanu could remember. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet beep of the heart monitor, and Keanu turned, back to his father, feeling a pang of dread in his chest. He didn't want to face the truth that was creeping ever closer, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time. How much longer would they have? The door to the room opened, and a nurse entered, her soft shoes making barely a sound on the floor. She approached Keanu and spoke gently, her eyes full of empathy. "Mr. Reeves," she began softly, "your father's doctor is on his way, but I wanted to let you know that we're doing everything we can. His condition is deteriorating." Keanu nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice betraying a sense of helplessness that he had been trying to hide. The nurse gave him a kind smile before leaving the room, and Keanu's gaze fell back to his father. He walked back to the bedside and sat down again, taking his father's hand in his. For the first time in a long while, Keanu allowed himself to feel vulnerable. The strong, composed man that the world knew him as didn't exist in this room. In this room, he was just a son, frightened and unsure, holding on to the last bit of time he had left with his father. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken connection. Then, Jack's voice broke the silence once more, weak but deliberate. "Keanu, I want you to know something." Keanu leaned in, his heart racing. "What is it, Dad?" Jack paused, his breath shallow. Keanu's heart squeezed as he waited for his father to speak, praying it wouldn't be something that would tear him apart. "I'm proud of you," Jack said slowly, his words coming out labored but filled with meaning. "I know I didn't always show it, but I've always been proud of the man you've become." Keanu's chest tightened. He had heard these words 1,000 times in his mind, but hearing them now, when it seemed like time was running out, brought both a sense of peace and an overwhelming sadness. He had always wanted to hear his father say those words, but he had never expected them to come so late. Tears pricked at the corners of Keanu's eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. He couldn't break down now, not in front of his father. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. You've done everything you could for me. You gave me everything you had, and that's all I ever needed." Jack nodded weakly, a faint smile crossing his face. "You always were a good son. I just never knew how to be the father you deserved." Keanu squeezed his father's hand tighter, feeling the weight of his words. There was nothing more to say. The truth was, Keanu had always known that his father had done the best he could, given the circumstances. They had both struggled to communicate, to bridge the gap between father and son. But in this moment, there was a sense of quiet understanding. Just as Keanu opened his mouth to speak again, the door to the room swung open, and Dr. Harris, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stepped in. His expression was grave, and Keanu immediately felt a sense of dread wash over him. "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Harris began, his tone gentle but firm, "I wanted to update you on your father's condition. We've been monitoring him closely, but his heart is struggling. He's not responding to the medication as we hoped." Keanu nodded, trying to steady his breath, though every part of him felt like it was falling apart. "What does that mean?" Dr. Harris paused, clearly struggling with how to say the words. "It means that your father's time is limited. We're doing everything we can to make him comfortable, but..." Keanu didn't need to hear more. The look in the doctor's eyes was enough. He felt his throat tighten, the lump that had been building inside him growing even larger. In that moment, everything changed. Keanu understood that he had no control over what was coming. Time was slipping away, and there was nothing left to do but be present. He turned back to his father, who was still awake, still holding his hand, still offering the silent strength that Keanu had always relied on. He knew this moment, This final stretch of time would be the most important of all. Keanu cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere." Jack gave him a tired smile, and with a slow, deliberate breath he closed his eyes once more, resting in the warmth of his son's presence. The hours that followed felt like an eternity, each moment stretching longer than the last as Keanu remained by his father's side. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor, a constant reminder that time was running out. The air felt thick with unspoken words, the weight of everything left unsaid now hanging over them. Keanu glanced at the clock on the wall, but it didn't matter how much time had passed. It all felt the same. His mind was racing, torn between the overwhelming grief of losing his father and the strange sense of peace that had settled in the room. For the first time, Keanu felt the weight of his father's life, his struggles, and his quiet love, all coming to a head in these final moments. In the dim light, Keanu could see the lines on his father's face more clearly. His hair, once dark and thick, was now thin and graying, and the strength that had defined him for so long seemed to be fading away. Keanu thought about all the years they had spent in silence, the unspoken words that had piled up like dust in the corners of their relationship. How many times had he wanted to say something, to break the silence and let his father know how much he meant to him? How many moments had passed, and now it felt like there was nothing left but these final seconds. Suddenly, Keanu felt the need to move, to do something, anything, to distract himself from the crushing reality of the situation. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline below. The lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. But as his eyes shifted back to his father, something in him shifted too. It was as if the weight of his father's presence suddenly became more vivid, more intense. All the memories, all the regrets, all the love he had ever felt rushed through him in an overwhelming wave. Without thinking, Keanu returned to his father's side and sat back down, taking his hand again. He could feel the faint pulse in his father's wrist, a reminder that he was still here, still with him, even if it felt like the world was slowly slipping away. "Dad." Keanu's voice was thick with emotion. "I never told you enough, how much you meant to me. I didn't understand what you did for me, not until now. I didn't know how much you gave up to be the father I needed. I just want you to know, I love you." His voice broke at the last word, but he said it anyway, and somehow, it felt like it was the most important thing he could have said. Jack's eyes fluttered open, weak but aware, and he squeezed Keanu's hand with whatever strength he had left. "I love you too, son," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Always have, always will." Keanu blinked back tears, his heart heavy in his chest, but there was a strange sense of relief in hearing those words. Even though they had never been spoken before, in this moment, they felt like everything he needed to hear. Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly. "It's time, Keanu," he said, his voice soft and resigned. "But you've got this, son. You always did. Just don't forget me, okay? Don't forget what we had." Keanu nodded, his throat tight. "I won't forget, Dad. I promise. I'll carry you with me. Always." And for the first time in years, Keanu allowed himself to close his eyes and just be, to accept the moment, as painful as it was, and to cherish it for what it was. A final goodbye, but also a beginning. A beginning of healing, of understanding, and of carrying his father's love with him even into the next chapters of his life. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful silence. Keanu stayed there for what felt like hours, holding his father's hand, letting the time stretch on without urgency or fear. He didn't know how much longer they had, but it didn't matter. Right now, all that mattered was being present, living in this moment with the man who had given him everything, even if he never knew how to say it out loud. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. Keanu had lost track of time. The soft beeping of the heart monitor, now slower and more erratic, was a constant reminder of the inevitable. His father's breathing had grown shallow, and the strength he had once carried with quiet dignity was slipping away with every passing second. Yet, in the stillness of the room, there was a profound sense of peace, a peace that Keanu never expected to find. He sat by his father's side, unwilling to leave, unwilling to let go of the man who had been his anchor, even when it had been hard to see. The room was dim, the fluorescent lights above casting a soft glow, almost as if the world outside had forgotten about the pain inside this little hospital room. All of Keanu's fame, his success, his accomplishments, they didn't matter here. Here, in this moment, all that mattered was love, connection, and the fleeting time they had left. Keanu looked at his father's face, the lines of age and pain etched deeply into his skin. There were moments when his father had seemed indestructible. To him, the tough, silent man who could fix anything, who always had the answers. But now there was nothing to fix, nothing left to do but to be there for him, to hold his hand, to listen to the rhythm of his breaths and find comfort in their shared silence. As the minutes passed, Keanu could feel his father slipping away. There was no dramatic moment, no last-minute revelation, just the gradual fading of life that he knew was coming. His father had always been a man of few words, and even now, in his final moments, there were no grand speeches or declarations. But what Jack had said earlier, those simple words, meant everything. "I love you," his father had whispered, and it was enough. It had always been enough. Suddenly, Keanu noticed a subtle change in his father's breathing, the rise and fall of his chest, slower now, more labored. It wasn't just a change in his body, though. It felt like a shift in the very air around them. Time was no longer on their side. "Dad?" Keanu's voice was a whisper, thick with emotion. He leaned in closer, his forehead resting gently against his father's hand. "I'm right here." Jack's eyes fluttered open one last time. They were barely able to focus, but Keanu could see the faint recognition still in them, that last flicker of connection. His lips parted, but no words came out, only a faint, rasping breath. Keanu squeezed his father's hand, willing him to know that he wasn't alone, that he never had been. A tear slid down Keanu's cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. There was no shame in the grief he was feeling. Not now, not in this moment. His father had spent his life teaching him to be strong, to be quiet in the face of hardship, to keep going even when the world was heavy. And now, in these final seconds, Keanu realized that strength wasn't about keeping it all inside. Strength was allowing himself to feel, to grieve, to mourn, to love. "I'm proud of you, son," Jack finally managed to say, his voice so faint it was almost a breath, a whisper in the wind. "Always have been." Keanu's heart shattered at those words, but he managed to reply, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'm proud of you too, Dad. I always have been." With those words, Jack's eyes fluttered closed once more. There was no struggle, no pain, just the quiet exhale of a life well lived, a life that had shaped Keanu into the man he was. Jack Reeves was gone, but his legacy, his love, his lessons, those would live on. Keanu sat still, his hand still gripping his father's, feeling the last warmth of his touch, the last beat of his heart. And in that moment he realized that the greatest gift his father had ever given him wasn't the things he had done for him, but the quiet love they had shared all these years. Love wasn't always loud, it wasn't always grand gestures. Sometimes it was the simplest things, a hand held, a moment shared, the unspoken understanding between two people who had walked through life together. For the first time, Keanu felt the weight of loss, not just the loss of his father, but the loss of time. He thought of all the years they had spent apart, all the words they never said. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he felt a strange sense of peace. His father had left him with more than enough to carry forward. He had left him with memories, with love, with strength. Keanu closed his eyes, letting the tears come freely now. There was no shame in it, no shame in feeling everything. He sat there for what felt like hours, his heart both broken and full, and he allowed himself to grieve. He allowed himself to mourn the man who had been his father, the man who had taught him how to live, how to love, and now, how to say goodbye. The sun was rising, casting a soft golden light through the hospital window, but inside the room, Keanu sat still, his eyes fixed on his father's lifeless form. The stillness in the room felt heavy but somehow peaceful. The beeping of the heart monitor, once a constant sound in the background, had long stopped, leaving only the silence. It was. The kind of silence that spoke volumes, both of loss and of love. Keanu's mind was a whirlpool of emotions. Grief, disbelief, relief, and even a strange sense of peace. He had spent so many years feeling disconnected from his father, wrapped in the busyness of life, and now, in the stillness of this moment, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. He hadn't realized until now how deeply he had relied on his father's quiet strength, how much of who he was had been shaped by the lessons Jack had taught him, even without saying a word. The nurse had come in, confirming the inevitable, and had gently placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. There was nothing left to do but sign the paperwork and make arrangements, but Keanu couldn't bring himself to leave the room just yet. He needed these last moments with his father, even if it meant sitting in silence, feeling the weight of everything that had been unsaid. He wasn't sure how long he had sat there, but eventually the hospital staff began to enter, preparing for the next steps. They moved with quiet efficiency, but Keanu barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the small space of this room, to the man who had shaped his life, and to the memories that were now all he had left. Jack's belongings were collected, a few small personal items, photos, and a worn-out leather wallet. Keanu held on to the old family photos the nurse had handed him earlier, his fingers tracing the edges of the black and white images, each one telling a story of a time long past. He looked at the photo of a young boy, a toddler with messy hair, smiling up at the camera with his father by his side. The love between them was clear even in the photograph, though Keanu had never fully understood the depth of it until now. As he stared at the pictures, memories flooded his mind. Memories of simpler times when life had been less complicated. He thought of the afternoons spent in the backyard, his father showing him how to fix things, the quiet conversations they'd had over dinner, and the long drives they took when Keanu was older, the silence in the car somehow comforting as if the world outside didn't matter as long as they were together. Keanu slowly put the photos down, his hands trembling slightly. The tears, which had been held back through the long hours of the night, began to fall freely now. He let them come, no longer trying to hold them in. The pain was raw and real, but somehow through it all, he felt a sense of understanding. His father's love had never been loud, it had never been flashy, but it had been steady. And now, as Keanu sat in the silence of this room, he realized that love was all he needed to carry forward. His father had taught him so much, how to be strong, how to navigate life, how to endure hardship. But more than anything, Jack had taught him the importance of being present, of being there for the people you love, even when life gets busy, even when it's hard. The things that had seemed so important in Keanu's life, the fame, the awards, the endless work, suddenly felt small. It was the relationships, the quiet moments, the people who stood by you in your darkest hours that mattered the most. Keanu stood up, wiping the tears from his face, and slowly walked over to the window. He gazed out at the city below, watching. As the world began to wake up, the sun was rising higher now, casting a warm glow over everything, and in that moment, Keanu felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The world was still turning. Life was still moving forward, even though he had just said goodbye to someone he had loved so deeply. He could hear his father's voice in his mind, reminding him to keep going. "You've got this, son," Jack had said just before he passed. Keanu didn't fully understand it at the time, but now, sitting here in the quiet aftermath of it all, he realized what his father had meant. Life wasn't about the grand gestures or the accolades. It was about the quiet moments, the love that never left even when everything else seemed to fade away. The journey wasn't over. It had just shifted. Keanu would carry on, not as the man he was before, but as a man who had been shaped by the love of his father and by the lessons he had learned in those final moments. He would live his life differently now. He would make time for the people who mattered, cherish the quiet moments, and never again take for granted the love that surrounded him. And so, with a deep breath, Keanu turned away from the window, ready to face the world again. But this time he would do it with a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of what truly mattered. His father was gone, but his spirit would live on in every choice Keanu made from this day forward. The days after his father's passing felt like a blur to Keanu. The funeral, the tributes, the quiet solitude of his home, it all came at him in waves, sometimes too much to handle, other times a quiet, overwhelming relief. But the days after were also filled with something unexpected: clarity. In the midst of his grief, Keanu began to reflect on everything his father had taught him and how it shaped the way he moved through the world. He found himself revisiting old memories, both happy and painful, as if trying to grasp something intangible about his father's life. There were so many lessons that his father had quietly imparted, like the importance of staying grounded, of being humble, and of knowing when to fight and when to let go. These were the things that Keanu knew he needed to carry with him for the rest of his life. And while he couldn't undo the lost years of distance between him and his father, he could honor him by living in a way that truly reflected the strength and love Jack had shown him all these years, even without the words. One afternoon, Keanu took a walk through his neighborhood, his mind drifting to the past, to the moments that seemed so small at the time but now felt so significant. He thought about the hours they had spent in silence, the times when they would just sit side by side, neither of them speaking but somehow knowing exactly what the other was thinking. It wasn't just the grand gestures that had shaped their relationship. It was the everyday moments, the shared cups of coffee, the routine visits to the grocery store, the silent but supportive presence his father had always given him. As Keanu walked, he passed by a small park where he and his father had spent hours playing catch when he was young. He sat on the bench near the field, closing his eyes and breathing in the familiar smells of the earth, the grass, and the air. It was, in this moment, that Keanu realized that his father had never really left him. His teachings, his love, and the way he had been there, quietly, steadfastly, were all a part of Keanu now. "Dad," Keanu whispered to the wind, feeling the absence but also the presence of his father surrounding him. "You're still with me, I know that now." He took a deep breath, standing up slowly, as if the weight of his grief had finally started to lift. It was time for him to start living again. The person he had become, shaped by his father's love and by his own struggles, was ready to face the future. Keanu knew that moving forward wouldn't be easy. There would still be moments of pain, times when the longing for his father's presence would almost be too much to bear. But he had a newfound strength, and he knew that the grief would one day settle, leaving behind only the beautiful memories and the love that never left. As Keanu made his way back home, his thoughts were less clouded with sorrow and more filled with gratitude. He had been given a gift, a reminder of the fleeting nature of life and the importance of cherishing the time we have with those we love. There were moments ahead that would challenge him, but he would face them with the knowledge that his father had prepared him for them in the quietest of ways. Keanu felt a profound sense of connection to his father now, one that transcended death, one that would live on in him and in every decision he made moving forward. "Thank you," Keanu said, softly looking up at the sky. "Thank you for everything, Dad. I won't forget. I'll make you proud." And with that, Keanu stepped forward, embracing the next chapter of his life, not as the man who had lost his father, but as the man who would carry his father's legacy forward. Weeks had passed since the funeral, but for Keanu the world still felt different. The grief that once consumed him now lived in the background, a constant companion, but no longer an overpowering force. He had begun to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning to live with it, to let it shape him into someone stronger and more appreciative of the time he had. Keanu had always been private, preferring to keep his emotions close, but now he found himself reaching out more. To his friends, to his colleagues, to people who had known his father in different ways. He wasn't just talking about the loss, but about the lessons, the love, the things he hadn't realized he had taken for granted. Slowly, he let people in, something that had been difficult for him in the past. The quiet strength that he had inherited from his father wasn't about keeping everything inside anymore. It was about being open, being vulnerable, and trusting that others would be there to share in his journey. Keanu started to spend more time with his family, his siblings, reconnecting in a way he hadn't done in years. They would gather together, remembering their father with fondness and tears, but there was also laughter, stories that reminded them all of the man who had shaped them, even from the sidelines. His father had always been a bit of an enigma, a man of few words, but in his absence, Keanu had started to understand the quiet wisdom that had guided him through life. It wasn't just the lessons his father had taught him directly. It was the things he had absorbed just by being near him. One evening, as Keanu sat on the couch with his sister, they flipped through an old photo album their father had kept hidden for years. Pictures of Keanu as a young boy, pictures from his father's childhood, and some they had never seen before. It was a treasure trove of memories they had forgotten. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt connected to his father in a way he hadn't even imagined possible. It was like his father was still there with them, speaking through the pictures, through the shared memories. "I never knew he had these," Keanu said, turning a page slowly, his finger brushing over an old photograph of his father, standing next to a car they used to have when Keanu was little. He never talked much about his past. "Yeah, he was always so focused on the present," his sister replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But I think he always wanted us to know where we came from, where he came from." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. It was becoming clear to him now that his father had carried a lot of his own pain, his own unspoken history, in silence. But he had never let it define him. Instead, he had made sure that his children knew love, even without the grand gestures, even without saying the words every day. Over time, Keanu began to re-engage with his work as well, though with a new sense of balance. The drive that had once consumed him, the long hours and tireless work ethic that had made him the star he was, no longer felt as important as it once had. Yes, he was passionate about his craft, but now he made time to step away, to reflect, to be with the people he loved. He took vacations, something he had never done enough of before. He learned to put his phone down, to stop answering emails after hours, to enjoy the moments that came with simply being alive. As the weeks turned into months, Keanu realized that his father's legacy was not just in the things he had taught him, but in the example he had set. Jack had shown him how to live with grace, how to carry the weight of loss without letting it define you, and now Keanu was doing just that. He wasn't letting grief control his life. He was learning to live alongside it, to take the lessons he had learned and turn them into something meaningful. One of the things Keanu did to honor his father was to create a scholarship in his name. It was something small but meaningful, a way to give back to the community that had supported him and his family throughout the years. Keanu knew that his father would have been proud, even if he never would have said it. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about continuing the quiet work of making the world a better place, just as his father had done. There were still tough days. There were moments when Keanu would find himself missing his father so intensely that it felt like a physical ache. But instead of letting that sadness consume him, he allowed it to remind him of how much he had been loved, of how much love had been given to him, even in the quietest moments. Keanu found strength in the memories, both the happy and the sad. And with that strength he moved forward, ready to face the future with a heart that was both heavy and full of gratitude. He would never forget the lessons, the love, and the legacy of his father. But he also understood that his life was his to live, and he was determined to live it in a way that would make Jack proud. It was a quiet evening when Keanu sat by the fireplace in his living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired. Over the past few months, the world outside was dark, but inside a warm glow filled the room as the fire crackled and popped. His mind wandered back to his father, to the conversations they'd never had, to the things that were left unsaid. It was funny, he thought, how silence sometimes spoke louder than words, how the smallest moments of connection left the deepest impressions. In the weeks since his father's death, Keanu had gone through the expected stages of grief, shock, sadness, acceptance, but now, with a sense of calm settling over him, he realized there was more to grief than simply moving through stages. Grief, he had learned, wasn't something to get over, but something to move alongside. It had changed him, but it had also opened his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Keanu's thoughts drifted to the lessons his father had imparted, not through speeches or advice, but through his actions. Jack had been a man of few words, but a man of great depth. He'd shown Keanu what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity, to endure pain without letting it swallow you whole. Jack had also taught him the power of presence, how sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply show up. No words, no grand gestures, just showing up and being there. And that was exactly what Keanu had done for his father in those final moments. He had been there, fully present, in the way that only a child could be for their parent. Even though the pain was immense, even though it felt like his heart might break, Keanu had been there, holding his father's hand, showing him that love could transcend even death. That thought comforted him now as he sat quietly by the fire. There was peace in knowing that he had been there for his father in the end. He had given Jack the gift of presence, just as Jack had given him that same gift throughout his life. Keanu thought about his father's final words to him. "You've got this, son." It had been simple, but they resonated deeply with him. Now, in the moment he hadn't understood what his father meant, but as he reflected on his father's life, his quiet strength, his ability to endure life's struggles without complaint, Keanu understood now that his father had been preparing him all along. Life would not always be easy. It would be full of loss, challenges, and unexpected turns, but his father had equipped him with the tools to face it all with grace. The fire crackled again, and Keanu felt a sense of finality. The sorrow was still. There, of course, it would always be there in some form, but in the silence there was a calmness that felt right. He could carry his father's memory with him, and in doing so he would honor him not by mourning endlessly, but by living in a way that made Jack proud. Keanu took a deep breath, his fingers grazing the edges of the old photograph his father had given him. His fingers touched the worn paper, and for a brief moment he felt the warmth of his father's hand on his shoulder again, guiding him, supporting him. In that moment, Keanu knew that his father had not truly left him. He was in every breath, every thought, every choice Keanu made. A realization washed over Keanu. Life was about finding balance. It wasn't just about the moments of joy or success. It was also about how we navigated the struggles, the losses, and the pain. Through his father, Keanu had learned that peace came not from avoiding hardship, but from facing it head-on, from finding moments of quiet within the chaos. It was time for Keanu to move forward, not in spite of the loss, but because of it. He would carry his father's legacy in the way he lived, in the way he loved, and in the way he persevered. The lessons his father had given him were not just to be cherished in his heart. They were to be shared, passed on, and lived out in every aspect of his life. The fire had burned low now, leaving only a soft, glowing ember. Keanu stood up and made his way to the window, gazing out at the stars above. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a sense of connection to the universe, to his father, and to himself. The journey ahead was still unknown, but he felt ready for it, ready to face whatever came with strength, grace, and love in his heart. And in that moment, Keanu smiled. His father had given him everything he needed to live a life filled with meaning, to love fully, and to never give up. He had the tools, he had the strength, and, most importantly, he had the love that would guide him through it all. Keanu sat in his garden early one morning, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun began to rise. He had always been a man of few words, but lately he found himself reflecting more deeply, letting the quiet moments speak for themselves. The garden, with its blooming flowers and the sound of birds chirping in the distance, felt like the perfect place to connect with his thoughts and with his father's memory. It had been nearly a year since his father had passed, but Keanu had made peace with the void that Jack had left behind. The grief was still there, woven into the fabric of his life, but it no longer dominated his every thought. Instead, it had become a part of who he was, something that shaped his perspective on life without defining him. Keanu had begun to understand that life wasn't about avoiding pain, but about embracing it. The moments of loss and hardship were as much a part of the human experience as the moments of joy and triumph. His father had lived a life of quiet strength, enduring loss and hardship in his own way, and Keanu had learned from that example. He realized now that strength didn't mean never breaking. It meant learning how to mend and move forward. As he sat there, the smell of fresh earth rising from the soil, Keanu thought about the legacy his father had left him. Jack hadn't been a man of wealth or fame, but his legacy was something deeper. The values he had instilled in his children, the quiet acts of love he had shown throughout his life. It wasn't in the material things Jack had given, but in the way he had lived, honestly, humbly, and without fanfare. Jack had given Keanu the greatest gift a parent could give, a sense of self-worth, of knowing that he was loved, even when words were left unsaid. Keanu also thought about his own journey, the one that had taken him through the bright lights of Hollywood and the shadows of personal loss. He had lived a life filled with challenges and triumphs, but none of it had felt as meaningful as the lessons he had learned from his father. His father had always been there, in the background, silently guiding him. And now, even in death, Jack's wisdom continued to shape Keanu's path. Keanu knew that he was in a different place now. He had grown not just as an actor, but as a man. He was no longer consumed by the pressure of success, the need to prove himself. He had discovered that his value didn't come from the roles he played on screen or the accolades he received, but from the person he was at his core. And that person, quiet, introspective, and compassionate, was a reflection of everything his father had taught him. "Thank you, Dad," Keanu whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the morning. "I know you're still with me." He stood up slowly, his heart filled with a deep sense of gratitude. He felt in that moment that his father's love would never truly leave him. It would live on in the way he treated others, in the way he embraced life, and in the way he shared the lessons Jack had given him. The lessons of patience, humility, and, most importantly, love. Keanu had learned that life was fragile, and it could change in an instant, but it was also beautiful, and it was meant to be lived fully. He understood now that he didn't have to be perfect, that it was okay to not have all the answers. What mattered was showing up, being present, and living, each day with intention. As he walked back into the house, Keanu felt a new sense of purpose. He had faced his grief, embraced it, and emerged from it stronger. And now he was ready to live the rest of his life, not as the man who had lost his father, but as the man who had been shaped by that loss, who had been changed by the love and wisdom his father had passed down. And so as Keanu stepped forward into the future, he carried his father's legacy with him. It wasn't a legacy of wealth or fame, but one of love, integrity, and strength. It was the legacy of a man who had given his son everything he needed to navigate the complexities of life with grace. Keanu had learned to let go, to forgive, and to love deeply, and in doing so, he had found peace.